Around 1883 in Farmersville, California, a boy was getting a paddling by his school teacher for bad behavior. Well, the boy's brother confronted the teacher later in the street, and heated words were exchanged. The brother drew his revolver and pistol whipped the school teacher until he lay unconscious on the ground. Then the brother holstered his gun, withdrew his bowie knife, and hacked off half the teacher's ear. Just as he was standing up from his unconscious victim, a deputy challenged him from behind, and the brother spun around, slashing the deputy's arm. Despite this, the deputy was able to disarm the man and take him into custody. This event was the first documented brush with the law for James Mckinney. For the next 20 years, Mckinney would drift between towns, getting into scraps and trouble and generally being a danger to society. It was rumored he had killed several men in Kingman, Arizona. In Visalia, while drunk, he got into trouble for shooting his dance partner in the buttocks because he didn't like the way she moved. Once sober, he paid for the young lady to visit the doctor where she was stitched up, and later it was rumored that they even became lovers. In 1899, another incident occurred when one of Mckinney's love interests came to him complaining about the treatment she had received from one of his friends, a gambler named Long Tom Sears. Incensed, McKinney cornered Sears in an alley behind Main Street and told him to draw his gun. Sears, full well knowing McKinney's fearsome reputation, tried to talk his way out of the fight and even threw his gun on the ground. At one point, Sears said to his friend, "Well, if we can't be friends, then go ahead and shoot me." And in a blink of an eye, McKinney pulled his six-shooter and shot his friend dead. The shot was heard by Deputy Sheriff John Crawford, who was in an outhouse close by. Crawford came running out of the outhouse and into the alley as he was still pulling up his pants. McKinney turned and let off a couple shots at him. Both bullets nicked the deputy and sent him running in the other direction. McKinney was later arrested when he was sober and put on trial. Once again, somehow he was acquitted, and the incident added to his already deadly reputation. In 1902, he was in Zalad's saloon in Porterville, drunk again. He pulled his six-shooter and blasted away at the ceiling fan, then the bottles behind the bar, and then the lights. Hearing the gunfire, the local deputy ran to the saloon with gun and club in hand. As McKinney was reloading, the deputy walked up to him and smashed him in the side of the head with his club. Stunned and stumbling, the outlaw cocked his revolver and shot at the deputy, hitting him in the side of the face. The deputy fell wounded, and while the other patrons looked on in stunned silence, the gunman calmly walked out of the saloon over the crumbled body of the deputy. Perhaps worried about vigilantes coming after him, he returned to the saloon with a shotgun. On the way there, a man stepped from the shadows, and McKinney let him have both barrels. The man fell in a heap. McKinney walked up to him, looked down at him, and in the dim light, he saw the face of the man he had just killed. It was one of his only remaining friends, Bill Lynn. Perhaps because of this, he turned around and left town, but not before he gunned down and wounded two other men while making his exit. McKinney returned to the Bakersfield area and hid out in a joss house, or a gambling house, and an opium den on the outskirts of Chinatown. With the outlaw was Al Hulse and his girlfriend Jenny Fox. Now, Hulse was an ex-convict, and the two were old drinking buddies. But despite the secrecy, word got around that the gunman was holed up in Chinatown. Lawmen quickly got a posse together to find and arrest him. They received a tip that McKinney was hiding out in the Joss house, and on the morning of April 19, 1903, a posse of 9 officers closed in. City Marshal Jeff Packard and Deputy Sheriff Bill Tibbett went in to search this building, while the others took up positions outside. As the men outside waited, straining to hear anything from inside, shots rang out as Packard and Tibbett busted down the door of Hulse's room. McKinney and Hulse were both behind the door with a rifle and a shotgun. Packard was hit and thrown back as he tried to rush through the doorway. Tibbet made it into the room, but as he entered, Hulse shot him from the side. The two outlaws then jumped over bodies laying in the doorway and headed for the back door. Deputy Sheriff Bert Tibbet, brother of Bill Tibbet, was behind the building. He rushed toward the rear door in response to the shooting. As he and another deputy approached the door, McKinney appeared, rifle in hand. McKinney got off a shot just as Bert Tibbet fired his shotgun, hitting McKinney in the head and neck. McKinney staggered back, and the other deputy finished him off with a shot through a window. The lawman poured into the house, but Hulse would not surrender until the lawman set fire to the building. After being smoked out, the lawman arrested Al Hulse and his girlfriend, dragging them off to jail. Both Jeff Packard and Bill Tibbet were still alive, though badly wounded. They were carried down the street to the Southern Hotel and given medical attention, but Tibbet died a short while later. Packard lingered for more than 12 hours before succumbing to his wounds. It was at Springfield, Missouri, that Bill had his celebrated fight with Dave Tutt. The fight put an end to Tutt's career. Now, I was a personal witness to another of his gun exploits, in which, though the chances were all against him, he protected his own life and, incidentally, his money. An inveterate poker player, he got into a game in Springfield with some big players, and for high stakes. Sitting by the table, I noticed, though, that he seemed sleepy and inattentive. So I decided to keep a close watch on the other fellows. Presently, I observed that one of his opponents was occasionally dropping a card in his hat, which he held in his lap, until a number of cards had been laid away for future use in the game. The pot had gone around several times, and was steadily raised by some of the players, Bill staying right along, though he still seemed to be drowsy. The bets kept rising. At last the man with the hat full of cards picked a hand out of his reserves, put the hat on his head, and raised Bill $200. Bill, surprisingly, came back with a raise of $200, and as the others covered it, he quietly shoved a pistol into his face and observed, "I'm calling the hand that is in your hat." Gathering in the pot with his left hand, he held the pistol with his right and inquired if any of the other players had any objections to offer. They hastened to reply, of course, that they had no objections whatsoever, and we went away from there. "Bill," I said when we were well outside the place, "I had been noticing that fellow's play right along, but I thought you hadn't. I was going to get into the game myself if he beat you out of that money." "Billy," replied Hickok, "I don't want you ever to learn it, but that is one of my favorite poker tricks. It always wins against crooked players." William F. Cody.
My husband and I kept up our little detours by ourselves as we neared the hour for camping each day. One day, one of the officers accompanied us. We left the higher ground to go down by the water and have the luxury of wandering through the cottonwood trees that sometimes fringed the river for several miles. As usual, we had a number of dogs leaping and racing around us. Two of them startled a deer, and the general bounded after them, encouraging the other dogs with his voice to follow. He had left his friend with me, and we rode leisurely along to see that the younger dogs did not get lost. Without the least warning, in the dead stillness of that desolate spot, we suddenly came upon a group of young Indian warriors seated in their motionless way in the underbrush. I became perfectly cold and numb with terror. My danger in connection with the Indians was twofold. I was in peril from death or capture by the savages, and liable to be killed by my own friends to prevent my capture. During the 5 years I had been with the regiment in Kansas, I had marched many hundreds of miles. Sometimes I had to join my husband going across a dangerous country, and the exposure from Indians all those years had been constant. I had been a subject of conversation among the officers, being the only woman who, as a rule, followed the regiment, and without discussing it much in my presence, the universal understanding was that anyone having me in their charge in an emergency where there was imminent danger of my capture should shoot me instantly. While I knew that I was defended by strong hands and brave hearts, the thought of the double danger always flashed into my mind when we were in jeopardy. If time could have been measured by sensations, a cycle seemed to have passed in those few seconds. The Indians snatched up their guns, leaped upon their ponies, and prepared for attack. The officer with me was perfectly calm, spoke to them coolly without a change of voice, and rode quickly beside me, telling me to advance. My horse reared violently at first sight of the Indians and started to run. Gladly would I have put him to his mettle then, except for the instinct of obedience, which anyone following a regiment acquires in all that pertains to military directions. The general was just visible ascending a bluff beyond. To avoid showing fear when every nerve is strung to its utmost and your heart leaps into your throat requires superhuman effort. I managed to check my horse and did not scream. No amount of telling over to myself what I had been told, that all the tribes on this side were peaceable, and that only those on the other side were warlike. What made me sure that these warriors whom we had just met were from the fighting bands was the recollection of some significant signs we had come upon in the road a few days previous. Stakes had been set in the ground, with bits of red flannel peculiarly fastened on them. This, our guide explained, meant warnings from the tribes at war to frighten us from any further advance into their country. Whether because of the coolness of the officer, or because the warriors knew of the size of the advancing column, we were allowed to proceed unharmed. How interminable the distance seemed to where the general awaited us, unconscious of what we had encountered. I was lifted out of the saddle a very limp and unconscious thing. Libby Custer.
Of all the bad men and desperados produced by Texas, not one of them, not even John Wesley Hardin himself, was more feared than Ben Thompson. Sheriffs avoided serving warrants of arrest on him. It is recorded that once, when the county court was in session with a charge against him on the docket, Thompson rode into the room on a Mustang. He bowed pleasantly to the judge and court officials. "Here I am, gents, and I'll lay all I'm worth that there's no charge against me. Am I right? Speak up, gents. I'm a little deaf." There was a dead silence, until at last the clerk of the court murmured, "No charge." A story is told that on one occasion Ben Thompson met his match in the person of a young English remittance man playing cards with him. The remittance man thought he caught Thompson cheating and indiscreetly said so. Instantly, Thompson's .44 covered him. For some unknown reason, the gambler gave the lad a chance to retract. "Take it back, and quick," he said grimly. Every game in the house was suspended while all eyes turned on the daredevil boy and the hard-faced desperado. The remittance man went white, half rose from his seat, and shoved his head across the table toward the revolver. "Shoot and be damned! I say you cheat!" he cried hoarsely. Thompson hesitated, laughed, shoved the revolver back into its holster, and ordered the youngster out of the house. Perhaps the most amazing escape on record is that when Thompson, fired at by Mark Wilson at a distance of 10 feet from a double-barreled shotgun loaded with buckshot, whirled instantly, killed him, and an instant later shot through the forehead Wilson's friend Matthews, though the latter had ducked behind the bar to get away. The second shot was guesswork plus quick thinking and accurate aim. Ben was killed a little later in company with his friend King Fisher, another bad man, at the Palace Theater. A score of shots were poured into them by a dozen men waiting in ambush. Both men had become so dangerous that their enemies could not afford to let them live. William Rain.
One of the most daring attacks that we ever made was at Fort Totten in the summer of '66. Hohe, the Assiniboine captive of Sitting Bull, was the leader in this raid. Wapepe, the fearless bear, who was afterward hanged at Yankton, was the bravest man among us. He dared Hohe to make the charge. Hohe accepted the challenge, and in turn, dared the other to ride with him through the agency and right under the walls of the fort, which was well garrisoned and strong. Wapepe and I, in those days, called each other brother-friend. It was a life-and-death vow. What one does, the other must do, and that meant that I must be in the forefront of the charge, and if he is killed, I must fight until I die also. I prepared for death. I painted as usual like an eclipse of the sun, half black and half red. Now the signal for the charge was given. I started even with Wapepe, but his horse was faster than mine, so he left me a little behind as we neared the fort. This was bad for me, for by that time the soldiers had somewhat recovered from the surprise and were aiming better. The soldiers' guns talked fast, but few were hurt. Their big gun was like a toothless old dog, who only makes himself hotter the more noise he makes. How much harm we did I do not know, but we made things lively for a time, and the white men acted as people do when a swarm of angry bees get into camp. We made a successful retreat, but some of the reservation Indians followed us yelling until Hohe told them that he did not wish to fight with the captives of the white man, for there would be no honor in that. There was blood running down my leg, and I found that both my horse and I were slightly wounded.
Rain in the Face then fought in the Fetterman Massacre and the Battle of Honsinger Bluff, where he ambushed and killed an Army veterinarian, Dr. Honsinger, a private and a civilian near present-day Miles City, Montana. His last fight was the Battle of the Little Bighorn in 1876. After this battle, he was pursued into Canada, where he stayed until 1880, and finally he returned to the U.S., surrendered, and was interned in the Standing Rock Reservation. Rain in the Face said of his surrender,
I fought for my people and my country. When we were conquered, I remained silent, as a warrior should. Rain in the Face was killed when he put down his weapons before the Great Father.
True to his word, just 8 years after his surrender, this fierce and wild warrior of the plains would pose in a bowler hat and a suit on his wedding day.